Well, good morning. It's my privilege to be here, and my pleasure also, since this part of the country is my favourite part, and you'll allow me a little soft spot for Australia, where I came from, but that's not part of the equation. But in the US, this is it. And I know this is pretty close to God's country. In fact, I was mulling over the meaning of Salem. I was thinking, how can I connect that with Liberty magazine? And you know, on the front cover recently, we had a story about the witchcraft trials there in Salem, Massachusetts. But I thought that wouldn't be a good one to show you. But this is Salem, and the word I'm sure you've long since learned means peace. And on the Sabbath day, of course, we all want peace. But I'm going to disturb you a little bit today, probably, I hope. You know, Liberty magazine is integrally tied to our Seventh-day Adventist proclamation. It's intimately tied to the history of our church. Very early on, in the 1800s, in the 1880s, the magazine was established under, of course, the name The Sentinel, the Liberty Sentinel, and Alonzo T. Jones with Ellen White. And in many ways, as I've read the story of A.T. Jones, he was the closest thing to a protege that she ever had. A young, energetic, wild-eyed sort of a guy that came out of the military, converted to Adventism, lived for a little while with Ellen White and understudied with her. He was quite unique. And if you read his story, it was his undoing at the end. He couldn't really restrain his enthusiasms enough. And as Ellen White said, and the main criticism of him, you know, he likes to argue too much. And there's a classic story that I read recently, just before the 1888 General Conference session. They were gathered together in a pre-meeting to discuss what were the Germanic tribes that made up the 10 toes of the statue. We don't talk about it much anymore, but that was central to an Adventist thinking. The great cavalcade of history is expressed through these prophetic images. And they were talking about it, and Uriah Smith got up and gave a bit of an exposition, but he couldn't quite settle it. And A.T. Jones leapt up and he says, "Brother Jones," he says, "may not know what tribes these stand for." He says, "but I know." And sitting next to him, Ellen White says, "Easy, Brother Jones, easy, Brother Jones." But I want you to know that religious liberty was important, is important, and is only going to become even more important. I want to thank you for what you've done for religious liberty. I presume since you've had your promotion on the Liberty Sabbath, you've done something, but that's maybe not all that you need to do. This magazine, and of course the larger work that we do with religious liberty, needs our support. This is the moment of opportunity. It's also the moment when I think we can clearly see the shape of things to come. It's not going to stay a good time for long. I'm hesitating because it appears that I'm about to brag, but it's only relative. You need to know that Liberty magazine, which has been around for 110 years under its present name, is currently by default the largest outreach magazine that our church has. You know, Signs of the Times. I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, fourth generation, and with great respect, especially when I went into editing with the Signs of the Times. We used to send out many, many hundreds of thousands of those. The time Pacific Press moved to Idaho, they joined these Times and Signs of the Times. At that time, they were 500,000 each. They joined into one magazine. It became a 500,000 circulation. Today, Signs of the Times is only about 50, 60,000. Message magazine, our outreach magazine for minorities, is toying with 20,000. Liberty magazine, which goes to legislators, thought leaders is the insulting term we use, implying that we're not thought leaders, but thought leaders, lawyers, mayors, all of these public officials, they are the target, people that we would not contact any other way. And we're sending out each issue about 165,000, sometimes a little more. I can't remember it less, but it's 165,000 per issue. We should be behind this. And it's well supported, but it's not growing. And I grew up with the view, as Ellen White said, of leaves of autumn. Our literature spread far and wide, bands of light around the world. And I've got to tell you, living in Hagerstown, Maryland, inside of the shell of the Review and Herald that was recently closed, it's hard for me to come to grips with this because I know our moment of opportunity is ahead of us. And I would appeal to you, make our religious liberty work stronger than it's ever been. You need to do something to show that Adventists are not just Christians like other people. We're not the only Christians. It's a message we need to learn. But we have a unique message. Ellen White called it present truth, something that's applicable to our day. And religious liberty has never been more appropriate than it is today. I think the title of the sermon today was, What's in a Name? And I don't know how many of you remember your Shakespeare. I know Ellen White took a few shots at William Shakespeare, probably the greatest, I shouldn't say probably, there's no dispute, the greatest figure in English literature. What's in dispute is whether he was real, who wrote those words. But he said he had Juliet say in the play Romeo and Juliet, of course the backdrop was a love romance against a backdrop of the feud between the two great families, Capulets and Montagues. She said, what's in a name? When she realized that Romeo was from the other party. What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell the same. Well, that sounds nice, but already I've told you that Salem is not the same as Salem, Massachusetts. There are distinctions in names. And in the old world particularly, a name meant everything. In fact, in many cultures, people were not named until they'd revealed something about their character. A name had with it the identity and sometimes even the very power of that individual. And when we talk about religious liberty, there's everything tied up in what it means, but just the term itself tells you very little. You should understand that at the moment, we've got a world that's going to hell in a handbasket. You don't have to be a Christian or a person of any religious faith to realize that. But you can go all around the world. Doesn't matter whether it was in the now defunct Soviet Union, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in the United States or Australia or any little banana republic in Latin America. They all believe in religious liberty. I've never met anybody that was against religious liberty. I remember sitting once a few years ago with Dr. John Gratz, now retired, the General Conference Director of Religious Liberty, sitting with him in Myanmar, talking to the Minister of Religion. Now, I'll change the country. Myanmar, we talked to him, but in Laos, I remember sitting there talking to the Minister of Religion in Laos. And this is a country where if you give out Christian literature and someone reports you, you go to jail for 5 to 25 years. It's not like if you litter here, the sign's up, $500 fine or 30 days in jail or whatever it is. You know that that's a far-fetched consequence that you're going to go to jail. You just pay a bit of money. I'm telling you, in Laos, you go to jail. There are 60 or 70 people right now in jail for doing that. But yet this man said to us, we believe in religious freedom. We believe in it. It's important. But he says, we just will not abide naughty behavior. That was the term he used. No naughty behavior. And the Soviet Union was the same. And of course, Laos is a communist country. But, these hardcore secular regimes, they believe in religious liberty because they believe in the rights of human beings. They happen to believe that religion is a delusion. So you indulge people in their view. Give them the right to believe in Jesus Christ or Buddha or whatever. But don't let them infect the society. So you need to be restricted in how you act on that religion. You're free to believe it, but you're not free to promulgate it. In other countries, Russia today, from the ex-Soviet Union, Russia today, they have religious liberty. What they also have is an understanding that true religion means the Eastern Orthodox Church. It is given political power and prestige and all sorts of legal allowances, and other religions, starting from that high point, devolve very quickly to where they're outright outlawed and not welcome in this society. And what is it in the United States? By law, the Constitution says, and you know, people very glibly say this country allows religious freedom and the Constitution says it. I've discovered hardly anybody knows the Constitution. Most people, when they talk about the Constitution, all they really remember and what they really subconsciously saying is the Declaration of Independence, which is not the Constitution. The Constitution has two little items relating to religion. One is just in passing, it says no religious test for public office. You know, we've had trouble with a Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, and I was as troubled as anyone when he was elected. He turned out to be a good, safe bet. We nearly had a Mormon president, and that rattled a lot of the Protestants in this country. And I don't think we're even close to having an atheist president. But that's the second of only two mentions. The other is half of an amendment. The First Amendment in its half says Congress shall make no law establishing religion, nor prevent the free exercise thereof. That's pretty good, but it's less than most people imagine. And like a lot of things that the Supreme Court pontificate on and have to interpret, you know, this is one of them. That, yes, if you understand the history of it, it makes sense. But for people that don't want to take the words at their face value, there's all sorts of cracks. And most of your fellow Christians in this country believe that religious liberty is religious entitlement. They believe that the laws and the structure of this country should be dedicated to advancing religion, and therefore their form of religion. And if your form of religion as a Seventh-day Adventist is not agreeable with Catholicism, which of course is a Johnny-come-lately viewpoint in the US anyway. This was a very anti-Catholic country in its early days. But if your religion doesn't agree with the so-called religious right or the mainline flag-waving form of religionist, you might find that you really don't have the right to be left alone, that your way will be hedged about. And I want to tell you, so there was a mention made earlier that, you know, religious liberty is, we hear a lot of it now. We do. But be aware that that talk is very dangerous for your form of religious liberty, for what Adventists have espoused from the beginning, the free and uninhibited right of all people to believe anything and to proclaim it and to worship it unhindered by the state or society. That is under direct threat. That is under direct threat. And as Seventh-day Adventists, we need to think for a minute, what is the basis of our religious liberty? Do we believe in religious liberty because the Constitution, in those little statements, stands for it? Do we believe because our history argues for it? And just yesterday I looked on television and I missed, it was a religious television program, and I missed the name of the presenter, but I think it was David Barton, the pseudo-historian beloved by the religious right. And he was sitting down with the announcer on this Christian network and going lovingly through the US history, showing how religion and Protestant faith is just suffused through all of the actions of the framers. And he told a story I hadn't even heard before. He said that as they had their first session establishing the assembly and the direction of the United States, and they settled on a few things and had chosen George Washington. And George Washington said, well, let's now repair to the church. And he said they went over and they had a religious meeting while they were still in session. And then after the religious meeting, they came back. Doesn't say anything about the structure of the country. It says a lot about their cultural assumptions as barely removed from the status of Englishmen, where the state religion was English, was the Church of England, and their cultural assumptions were all religious. Doesn't say anything either, and he wouldn't want to mention it, about the fact that most of them were either avowed members of the Masonic order, which is very hard to turn into a Christian subset, or they were deists, which is also very hard to accommodate with a biblical-based Christianity. Deism was the acceptable form of atheism in that day. But, you know, whether it's the vision that this man proclaimed or the atheism and the Masonism, it doesn't matter, because formally and legally they set up a country where religion was not consciously incorporated into the mechanisms of government. And you and I should be grateful of that. It's not necessarily the way God would run his government. It wasn't how he ran the theocracy, and it's not the way he's going to run it in heaven when we're all redeemed, and those of us that are going to be redeemed and glorified. But it is the safest model here, because we don't know who the prophets are that are authorized by God to mandate things in the civil sphere. And we don't know which king will turn out to be a Manasseh or a Josiah. We don't know that. So the safety and separation, the biblical principle of separation of church and state is pretty easy to establish. Jesus, you know, there before Pilate, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, he says, my followers would fight for me. Well, there go the Crusades right away, right? No, we're not there. We're passive toward earthly things. You can go to the Old Testament, of course, with the model of the theocracy, find something uncannily similar to Islam. But I don't know if you've read the Quran. Unfortunately, too many of us haven't read much beyond, even in the Bible, beyond the clear word, but that's another story. Read the Quran sometime. There's no such thing as separation of church and state in Islam. No such thing. And so to make a model between a theocracy that is a clear set-aside in Old Testament history and the models that Muslims and even inadvertently the religious writers bring forward, it's just not the way to go. But I believe you and I, when we support religious liberty, need to keep in mind that, yes, we're privileged to live in a country that by a constitutional set-aside allows religious freedom in a way that is fairly unique. In fact, it's very unique in modern societies. But don't confuse that with God's way. It is not a sacred document. There's nothing sacred about the Constitution. If you would read it, you would find that it's an obscure document. You would find that it authorizes slavery. It diminishes the rights of women. It's based, as the Supreme Court unveiled recently to the chagrin of many people, you know, it has a corporatist viewpoint. In fact, if you study your American history, they were very loath to give the voting to even the men. It was originally thought best only for landowners, property holders, and the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're lucky that happiness made it, because the original document from John Locke said property. There's nothing evil or wrong about it, but it's not God's word. And through a great happenstance of history, we have a constitution that aligns quite well with the biblical injunction to worship God regardless. But it is not the sacred document. God's word is. And you and I need, I believe, in these days to base our faith upon God and his word. You know, the text that we read as we started off from Acts chapter 4, and I almost started off working with Liberty Magazine preaching from this text. But, you know, this was the second sermon that Peter gave after Pentecost. And Peter and John, remember, came there through the gate beautiful, and there was a lame man, and they healed him, and everything just blew out of control, and they were preaching the resurrection from the dead, as it said. We forget that was a revolutionary concept. The Pharisees were Jesus' most friendly party, even though he criticized them directly the most. But the Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in miracles, like a lot of the Christians around you today. You know, Christianity in the Western world has become, you know, pretty much just wise sayings of Jesus. something Thomas Jefferson was pretty heavy on. But I remember reading a few years ago, one of the Archbishops of Canterbury, said publicly to the newspaper reporters he didn't believe in miracles, he didn't believe in the virgin birth, he didn't believe in basically anything supernatural. But he had a high regard for the things that Jesus told us about living a good, responsible, profitable life. When Peter and John stood before the people and proclaimed it was a near revolution, they were arrested, which is nearly always a consequence to speaking truth, biblical truth. And the next day when that text appears, they were asked by the authorities, the same people that had killed Jesus, remember. They were not to be taken lightly. These were not just bothered church leaders. They were bloodthirsty, I was going to use the word perverted, but they were perverted from the doctrine of God, of Christ. They were dangerous. They said, by what power? In verse 7, by what power? Or by what name did you do this? Even in the New Testament, there's a lot of parallelism. And they're equating power and name. There is power in the name Jesus Christ, authority. And it says, then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers of the people and elders, if we are being examined today concerning a good deed done to a cripple, by what means this man has been healed, be it known to you all and to the people of Israel, that by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man is standing before you well. I've got to tell you, right now we're at a dangerous pass. We've been delivered by the electorate not the electorate, but the partisan voters for the Republican Party. But there was a candidate that unleashed all of the political aspirations of our fellow membership, and we'll see where that goes. But what troubled me greatly was that it unveiled a sort of a secular aspiration within our church. And the way it worked its way out, though, was that we would not share what we stand as Seventh Adventists. We're under a lockdown. Nobody to speak of the things that we really stand for. We're controlling the message, and it resonates with me because I was in Australia when the Ford thing, when the Lindy Chamberlain case erupted. And the reaction of our church leadership was to contain the message, control it. And so nothing happened except was given out from the division headquarters. By the end of the trial, pretty much all that was going on in the church was crisis management. And the way that it devolved, we ended up being portrayed as a mafia-type group that were very controlling, that had bizarre doctrines, that we had child sacrifice, that we used the power of law to stop films or any information that was negative on us. It's very sad in Australia. I thought whenever any Adventist or any situation created a situation where people were asking who are Seventh Adventists, that we would immediately say, we are these people. This is our hope. We are people that are promoting Jesus Christ and his soon return. We have a message for you. And this will not be the only chance, I can assure you. The religious liberty situation is heating up. You and I are going to be brought before authorities one way or another, like Peter and John. And we're going to be asked, why, what power, or by what right, or by what name do you even have your organization? Why should there be a Seventh-day Adventist church? Why not join with the Episcopals down the street? Why not join with the Holy Father in his call for brotherhood and salvation of the species as we protect the environment? Why are you separate? And we have to tell them. Do you think it's an answer to say, oh, we run these hospitals, or we even run educational institutions, or, we're good people, we have a health message, we live 7 years longer than you? I can't think of a better way to have people hate you than to tell you that you live longer than them or that you're healthier than them. I always thought that, and I found out a few years ago that we'd done some studies, and that's just exactly the way it is. We have to point people to not ourselves, but to Jesus. And we have to point them to a greater liberation. You know, this afternoon, I hope you come. I want to share with you, in particular, some things from the Pope's encyclical on the environment. It's an interesting document. At the end, he says that we're all heading toward that eternal Sabbath. There's an interesting statement for you. We need to, though, in a correct way, explain the same thing. We're not against this world, but you know, what does the hymn say? This world is not my home. And I believe the worst thing we can do is to think that we're here in our organization. Religious liberty is forward-looking. It always was. And with A.T. Jones, what set him on fire, if you read the history of the Seventh-day Adventism, the 1888 message, it was religious liberty and the imminent Sunday law that we still expect, although you don't hear much about it, but at that time they thought that it was just days away. And immediately Jones was quite convinced that we needed to revive ourselves in preparation for this standing before authorities, figuratively. Same dynamic today, exactly the same. Exactly the same. So Peter says, by this man whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man is standing before you. A week ago, with my family, I went for the second time for me on the 3ABN tour of Israel. And I'm sure there's other people here that have been there. Like I say, I've been twice, but both fairly recently. The first time was impressive enough for me. I thought I have to take my family along. And one of the payoffs for me was I got to baptize my son in the Jordan River. One of the few benefits I've found from being ordained. It was later in life for me, and it ended up costing me a lot of money because I don't have deductions. And by the way, I should tell you, it's very interesting. When I first started with Liberty Magazine, for one reason or another, I'd go to New York a lot and talk at some of these really big black churches where in the back room it was like the parade ground drill. There'd be sometimes 10 or 20 deacons and deaconesses in uniform, nice uniforms often, lined up for inspection with the pastor, and everything was pretty spick and span and drill, and yes sir. And the pastor often would turn to me, now how do we address you? I'm thinking, this is not good. I've got to have rank here. And I'd say, well, just call me editor or whatever. And it was usually enough. But, they'd get at you. Now, what are you? Are you ordained? Are you a pastor? And woe betide you. And it happened to me a few times. Well, I'm not ordained. So they'd introduce you as brother so-and-so is here to say this. And in their constituency, that meant a lot. So I could tell. I was sort of having to prove myself. And the best I can say is several times after I'd finished, then I was suddenly pastor or elder afterwards. That was nice. But, what's in a name? Everything, because it carries, in this case, some distributed authority, but the ultimate authority comes from Christ, obviously, always. And when we say we're a Christian, it should have some authority. But anyhow, I took my family to Israel, and for the second time, certain things hit me. I've been to Rome a lot of times, and I don't care to go back again because, the pilgrim route hasn't changed a lot since the times of Martin Luther, when he got offended by the contradictions between all this semi-mystical stuff. Like, for example, this last trip to Rome, we went to a church I'd never seen before, to be honest, the Basilica of St. John without the walls. Never knew it existed, I guess because I didn't go without the walls on other trips. But a fair way out from the center of Rome, here's this huge basilica, all to honor, did I say St. John? St. Paul, to honor Paul, and they have there the manacles that he was manacled in, and supposedly his tomb. Interesting. But I also noticed there were pictures of all the popes around the wall. There was a square laid out when they built it, and they're running out of space. As I remember, only 2 more spaces. I don't know what they'll do when they run out. You and I won't have to worry. But what they had at that church was the forearm of, now I'm going to forget her name, the mother of Mary. The forearm. Who pulled the body apart? It's amazing. Very important for Roman Catholics. I don't know if you realize it. They don't just believe in the virgin birth. They believe that her mother had a virgin birth. Since Mary is elevated almost to the level of God in heaven, she needs to come from a pretty holy background. So her mother is that way. But what impressed me as I went around to these places, starting with the Sea of Galilee, then into Nazareth, and in the Jerusalem area more proper. And of course, I didn't see violence, although at one place someone was stabbed the day before we arrived there at the Church of the Sepulchre. There's a lot of agitation. But what impressed me is not what's happening today. You know, in Israel is an armed camp waiting for something to happen. But as I thought back on it, is how violent and forbidding was the time in the gospel era, when Jesus appeared. You know, if you read those stories, it gives you that idea that the water was rippling and it was quiet and peaceful. On a certain level it might have been, but it was against the backdrop of rebellion. This was just years before the most cataclysmic event that ever fell upon the state of Israel. And I would put that up against the Holocaust, because Israel was destroyed when the Romans finally had enough of them. They killed about 1 million people in Jerusalem, and at least 100,000 went into slavery. And in Rome, you can see on the Arch of Titus, there's the engraved story of them pillaging Jerusalem, bringing back the vessels back to Rome. They destroyed them so utterly, they were determined that the Jewish nation would never rise again. And Jesus' own followers were shot through with revolutionary viewpoints. Remember, they were zealots, a few of them. And every time he made an agitation in the temple or elsewhere, it wasn't just that he theologically offended the rulers. They were scared out of their wits because the Romans would likely come in and shut the whole game down. And when Jesus said, you know, if you've got a coat or if you're asked to go a mile by the Roman soldier, you know, go 2 miles. He wasn't just talking a nice theoretical, good-deeding sort of Christianity. He was talking in the context of rebellion and occupation. Was no different from when, you know, our several hundred thousand, I'm hesitating because I've listened to hearings and there were twice as many soldiers in Iraq as we ever were told officially. But, you know, when we were there, you know, our military patrols were going up and down the street, kicking down the doors whenever they felt like it and terrorizing people and so on. You believe that people like to see one of the Western patrols? I think not. And so when people in Jesus' day saw a Roman soldier, it was the implied barbarism of the occupier. Anything could happen. And when we were on this trip to Israel, we spent a little bit of time at Masada there, that mountaintop fortress, where about 1,000 holdouts from the rebellion held out about a year beyond the destruction of the main nation. But the Romans got them. They built, you know, it's at least 1,400 foot high off the plain that comes up from the Dead Sea. It was never explained to me clearly, but from Masada you can look out on the Dead Sea. It's really just the cliffs on the edge of it looking down to the Dead Sea. But, you know, it's a mesa bigger than anything almost outside of the Grand Canyon. About 1,200, 1,400 foot, I think. The Romans actually built not a ramp, but a little add-on mountain on the side of it where they could bring their siege engines up so that they could destroy them. It happened that they all committed suicide, but, you know, like Samson and others, suicide in the face of certain oblivion is not quite the same as suicide, a suicidal act out of depression. The Romans would have not spared anyone. If there was anyone spared, it would be for slavery, which was worse than death. As I think Simon, I wish I could remember his last name, the leader of the Zealots said, They thought they were doing a favor to their families to kill them. This was the context that Jesus came to. He came in the context of the Herods, because the Herod in his time, the fox, according to Jesus. Liberty Magazine is not partisan political, but we have to speak to political realities. Jesus did. But we dare not be partisan. But, Jesus dealt with a Herod. He was the most bloodthirsty, bestial. You read his private life, it's bizarre. He died from a disease, someone that was having sex with the dead. The debauchery, the cruelty, the revolutionary ferment in Jesus' time was phenomenal. And yet he could say, my kingdom is not of this world. My followers will not fight for me. We're heading to another world. And you and I, as this country eventually, and I don't know any more than you, the process, but I know the end. This country will collapse. This country will give away every principle of the Constitution. Ellen White promised that to us. And when that day comes, our commitment to religious liberty better be on a religious basis, on the basis of Jesus and him alone, not on some fanciful interpretation of the Constitution, which may have moved beneath our feet anyway. We serve God. We're otherworldly oriented. Our kingdom is yet to come. And of course, you and I know instinctively as Seventh-day Adventists and students of history and the Bible, of course we should be good citizens here and now. But be careful. The swastika was on the wall at the back of the Seventh-day Adventist churches in World War II with hardly a battle. And when Homeland Security demands certain things of you, are you going to give in to it automatically? When there's a martial law nationally or regionally, and they forbid the right of assembly, most people haven't thought about it. The world doesn't end with martial law, but the right of assembly does, unless you're the prevailing group. If they say, the coalition headed by His Holiness and other regional leaders in these emergency times, yes, they can meet on Sunday. But beyond that, under martial law, no more than 3 or 4 people at any one time. What are you going to do? If you meet here, there might be a tank come along and deal with you. If you meet in the home, already, if you meet in homes, regulations will say that's illegal. I don't think you know that. It's not allowed to have church meetings in homes. It's just most people don't push the limits on it. There are tests that are easily extrapolated from today that we will have to face, because your fellow believers in many countries have already faced them. And we need to decide, are we true to Christ, or are we true to some sort of moral construct that's a mixture of a constitution, of a society, and of a sort of a religious morality and of relativism? That doesn't end very well. In the Sabbath school class, there was a mention of Rwanda. You know what happened in Rwanda? The Hutu members, hundreds of them, flooded into our headquarters church, asking for refuge. The union president, a Tutsi, stood up and he said it was God's will that they die. And he summoned the authorities who dealt with them all. I don't know how God's going to deal with that man, but that action is wrong. We can't afford to let societal norms colour how we apply religious liberty. It needs to be applied directly on the Christian model, the model that Jesus gave us. And the name Jesus should mean something. It has power. The term religious liberty should mean something. It has power if correctly understood. But I'll leave you with this message. It is not understood now. And if you turn on most any religious radio or television, their discussion of religious liberty, I'm telling you, is entitlement. Because they are not necessarily, by and large, any more positive to your form of religion than Islam or whatever. And remember what's happening now. a certain New York developer who none of us know whether he'll be elected or what he would do if he were, but his public statements against Islam, which have been provoked by many actions of that group, those statements would mean, acted upon, the end of this broad-based view of religious liberty. And once you start slicing and dicing on who is worthy of religious freedom, it's over. It's over. I want to conclude by telling a story that it's really a story on me. I think Dr. McVeigh heard me last time we met, but it really affected me. It's nearly 10 years since my father died, and I haven't gone through anything in that regard that all of us haven't or won't. But it was a troubling context. And then knowing my father, it was sort of bizarre because he never seemed to lose energy until I got the call at my office that he was in a bad shape. He'd preached on the Sabbath, and I think this was the Sunday I got the call. On the Sabbath, he'd preached at his church, lots of energy, he was 81. But he didn't feel well that night, so he checked himself into the hospital, and immediately they found that he had cancer that proved to be largely inoperable. So I flew down to see him, got there just in time as they wheeled him off for the exploratory surgery. And we talked for a little bit, and he started to reminisce about his many years of working in the church. He'd been head of the temperance department at the General Conference and public relations and temperance in Australia, and he had an interesting story, interesting history, and I'd been privileged to share a little bit with him. And we shared together one experience in 1986 at a conference he held in Nice, France. It was under the auspices of the French Prime Minister's office, and he had some interesting guests. The Minister of Health from the Soviet Union was there, the Speaker of the House of the Saudi Parliament was there, and one of the guest speakers was Jacques Cousteau, who had actually, ironically, flown in from Miami for the meeting. But he was mad because when he arrived, nobody was at the airport to meet him. So my father, from his hospital bed, actually just moments before they wheeled him into surgery, he said, "Do you remember?" He says, "Jacques Cousteau." He says, "How I had to go and persuade him to come over and talk to the group." And the clincher came when my father told Jacques Cousteau, he says, "How come you haven't done anything on the Barrier Reef in Australia?" And Dad says, my other son, has been asking. And Jacques Cousteau says, "Well," he says, "I'm planning that in a couple of years." And so he melted a bit then, and so he said, "What language do these people speak?" And Dad says, "I think most of them know English." So Jacques Cousteau appeared, and I was actually sitting on the stage when he came. He came in for half an hour, spoke in perfect English. And next to me there was a Frenchman who hissed to another Frenchman, and I know French, and he says, "What an insult." He says, "A Frenchman speaking English in France." So my father shared all of this stuff, and it was a bittersweet moment, and they took him off, cut him open, nothing they could do. In fact, it was certain he would be dead within a few weeks. And afterwards, there was a semi-normalcy as he recovered. And so I went back home, put the next issue of Liberty together, and I wrote in the editorial a connection on this, because I found a religious liberty connection. So I wrote about this incident with my father. And then a few days later, I got the call that things were really bad, and he was in intensive care. So I flew back quickly, and the day before he died, or actually he died that night, I remember him sitting up in the bed with everything stuck out of him, including a tube down his mouth. And I read him the editorial, and he was able to talk. I don't understand to this day how he could talk and function, but you know, it was a funny moment. And I read it to him, and I expected him to say, "Oh, that's good. I'm glad you included that," or something like that, as he always did. And when I finished, he said, "It's okay." He says, "But there's something missing. There's something missing." And this was not the moment I needed even a minor critique. I knew these were the last few moments with my father. And he'd always been positive with me, never anything other than that. And here, there's just like a little cloud. What's he talking about? And then he let the penny drop. He says, "You must present Christ." And it's not like I never had presented Christ before, but it was a message that just hit me between the eyes there. and I'm certain of it now. Religious liberty without Christ is worthless. Religious liberty as just a legal intervention for Seventh-day Adventists in the workplace is worthless. It's not that that is a pointless exercise. We should defend our members whenever we have the point of law, as Paul used his Roman citizenship. But if it's not Christ-centered, it's worthless. If Adventism is not Christ-centered, it's worthless. I had a conversation with one of our leaders. I won't name the person the other day. I'm ending at the same point I started. I am in meltdown because of closing the Adventist Review. I've got to give it to you, the Review and Herald, not the magazine. And I went and talked to this leader a couple of days before they took the action, which I knew for many years was going to come. And I said, how could you do this? I said, the Review and Herald Publishing Association existed before the church was formed. Remember, Ellen White and James White, with their own money, started the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald, then raised monies for a little printing press and so on. It existed before they formed the church, which really was structured around it. And as I said before, it's so central to what we're doing. And I said to this person, I said, this is the very heart of Adventism. And this individual says, no, Jesus is the heart of Adventism. And I do agree with that point. At the time, I said, well, that's a nice theological point, but it's not historically true about this church. And I'll stick to my point. But as far as what we stand for, yes, there's just no point in it all unless it's focused on Jesus. We need to be careful on this. I'm old enough to remember Sabbath school classes, good deeds done today, clothing given out. I know why they did it, but that took everything in the wrong direction. We need to exemplify Jesus Christ. Every Christian has taken on themselves the name of Jesus. And there's a big dispute among some Protestant circles as to whether Islam even has the same God. Give them the benefit of the doubt. They've invoked the same God, but they surely don't worship him correctly or understand him correctly, as the same problem that many Christians have. But we should vindicate Jesus through our lives and our actions. That's what makes him real, not whether, the 28 fundamentals we have can be correct. We would all fail the test if we give you a piece of paper and asked you to even enumerate 28 fundamentals. I've tried the game on the Biblical Research Institute. Nobody can recount them, but all of us should be able to live out in our lives and everything that devolves from our Christian commitment, the loyalty to Christ and the assimilation of his principles into our life. That's what it's about. And I want to encourage you to join with Liberty Magazine and our Religious Liberty Group in advancing the understanding of a soon-coming Christ. It's well advanced through the principles of his kingdom, exemplified in the principle of religious liberty. God bless you. Let's bow our heads for a word of benediction. Dear Lord, we thank you for the fact that we're alive in this time in history. The Bible says that many people have desired, prophets have desired to live in these times. Sometimes they're exciting, other times they're frightening, other times they're just deadening to our sensibilities. But I pray, dear Lord, that you'll give us the mind of Christ, the aspirations of heaven as we practice the faith of Jesus, both the active part and the patience that goes with it. And may we and all of our fellow Adventists and all that want to join with us, because there are many not of this pasture, may we all join together and move unitedly toward a great time of liberation, not when we discover religious liberty, but when it is practiced in the fullest and truest form in your presence. And this